This is the American city of Monroe. Monroe is a large city on the mid-Atlantic coast of the eastern seaboard. It was a cradle of revolution in its early years and is now home to a great controversy: urban freeways. Let's take a look at how this all happened. This is the neighborhood of Chapel Hill in Monroe as it would have been seen in the early half of the 20th century. It is a majority African American community home to the Episcopal Church of St. Mary, of which the neighborhood is named. Unfortunately, this wonderful neighborhood has been tagged for redlining by the city's government. Redlining was a practice from the 1930s New Deal that tagged neighborhoods based on their trustworthiness to pay off government-given mortgages. Neighborhoods were given a rating of A through D, A being the most trustworthy neighborhoods and D being the least. D-rated neighborhoods, shown in red, were often African American communities like in Monroe here. Redlining greatly discouraged these neighborhoods by disincentivizing investment and put them on a downward path towards the bulldozer decades before urban freeways were even conceived. After city governments disincentivized urban living post-World War II, wealthier white residents began to flee intercity neighborhoods to the suburbs. This phenomenon was known as white flight, and we still feel its effects today. This drastically lowered urban populations in hard-hit cities, primarily in the Rust Belt region, and changed demographics forever. Shown here is Levittown, Pennsylvania, where only white residents were allowed to reside. It is extremely far from Center City, Philadelphia, with very little public transportation, meaning that residents had to use private automobiles to commute. This began a common trend in the United States of incentivizing cars, which further widened the racial rift in urban areas and continued the rolling trend of turning Chapel Hill here into a construction site. It was not until the 1950s that urban renewal and the construction of urban freeways really took off. In 1956, President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act. This act imposed a massive subsidy for the construction of freeways since the federal government would pay for 90% of the construction costs. This began a rush to construct as many freeways as possible for the next 3 decades. Most places that planned to construct freeways consulted one man to design their networks. That man was Robert Moses. Robert Moses was the Secretary of Parks and Recreation in the state of New York, but he had much more power in the construction of freeways. He constructed nearly 700 miles of roadway and evicted 500,000 people from their homes because of his plans. At the height of his reign, he held more power than the mayor of New York City and even the New York State governor. One of Moses's most infamous acts was during the construction of the Southern State Parkway in Long Island, New York. He purposely built the overpasses crossing the roadway too low so that buses of people who couldn't own cars, usually African Americans, couldn't reach the beaches on the south shore of the island. Residents who found their homes in way of the freeway were forced out of their homes into extremely unsafe project housing blocks for often very little compensation. Sadly, most neighborhoods that received urban freeways never recovered and are still very blighted today. With so many negative effects of constructing urban freeways, one may be confused as to why there is no opposition. However, the reality was quite the opposite. Local committees in communities impacted by proposed freeways were often organized against their construction. One of the most successful activists for these groups was Jane Jacobs. Jacobs was well known for her involvement in stopping the construction of the Lower Manhattan Expressway in New York. She is still regarded as one of the most influential activists in freeway revolts. Unfortunately, successful revolts like Jacobs's had a silver lining. The most successful revolts were led by white residents like in New York or San Francisco. Freeway revolts led by African American residents were often quelled very early on and never saw fruition. Sadly, neighborhoods like Chapel Hill never had a fair chance of ending freeways before the first buildings were even acquired. This was yet another example of racial inequality in public opinion and shows the unfortunate truth about freeway revolts. Throughout the entire history of freeway construction, there has been much controversy. Whether it comes from racism and routing choices, methods of acquiring land, or even the unfair relocation of residents in the way of the freeway, there has always been outcry. Thankfully, there has been progress in fixing these former mistakes. In numerous cities across the world, there has been a growing movement to remove freeways. From Portland to Rochester, San Francisco to Seoul, former scars cutting their way through cities have been healed. Hopefully here in Monroe, a similar future is coming. A future where Chapel Hill is a great African American community once again.